The mill owes its very existence to the river. The mill sluices and channels were made to harness the power of the water. There is abundant food in the river that powers the river's wildlife. Both the moorhens and the family of mallards by the sluice are true wild river birds, not dependent on any handout of bread. They feed on a rich natural diet, relishing river plants. In its heyday as an active working mill, the millhead channel was usually kept wide and high with a full volume for an optimal operating height. Throughout the mill's life, its man-made bank has steered the water in its centuries-old artificial channel, or leat, down to the mill. Generation upon countless generation of young mallards have fed in this same spot. Each have been watched over by concerned mothers. The leat channel that loops round from the river to the mill goes on through the mill to emerge as the milltail, rejoining the river. It's a characteristic waterway feature of mills that can usually still be found even if the mill has disappeared. These leats are usually at least as rich in wildlife as their rivers, for many were dug in Saxon days and nearly all as long ago as the 14th century. The changeable height of the leat's water level often brings new food within the range of the river ducks, which helps their success. In today's programme, I'm focusing on the mill's waterways, for these ancient channels hold answers to some modern problems, from the drying up of rivers to the fear of floods and our concern of water quality. Incredibly, mills are part of the answer to that as well. Yet when we start to look for the signs of the effect of mills, one plant that almost owes its survival to them lives right beside this one.
These giant-sized leaves belong to a plant called butterbur, and John Gerard, the 16th century herbalist and early naturalist, suggested a very sensible use for them. And that's as a sunshade or parasol, because they really are large enough to keep off the sun's heat on a hot day like today. He also suggested they were very good as an umbrella. It's not so silly, but what is silly is why you can't find them around much of Britain. Where you do find them tends to be fairly localised. They are a plant that likes living behind watermills. Why? When you've got all of the countryside around that is a wetland that they could live in very well? Well, the reason is quite straightforward. When you're a plant this big and there are cattle around on grazing land, you tend to be pushed away. Certainly if it's arable, you're not going to be surviving the ploughing that's going on. Whereas when there's an intense amount of work, people are focusing on making the flour or whatever else they're producing inside the mill, they really don't worry about the vegetation behind. The river, they worry about the level for running the place. So the plant itself can just get on in this oasis, this quiet bit of peace, century after century, and become an enormous stand of butterbur like this.
The butterbur has been protected by the presence of the mill, and plants like it are indicators of riverside changes. On my frequent journeys up and down the river, I look out for such signs to reveal the state of the wetland habitat supported by the mill. While the butterbur may be an extreme example of a plant needing long continuity habitat without disturbance, the stately stand of yellow flag iris grows proudly by the mill for the same reason. My interest is not just idle curiosity. As legally the miller, I control the sluices and so the water levels, which affects growth of plants like this water figwort. It stands tall on flanged stems like green girders. But in contrast to the showy iris, the figwort has tiny ball-shaped flowers. The mill stands over its mill stream, now a relic of a bygone age. Yet at one time, nearly every village with a river had a mill. The lushness of this river's vegetation would be far less without the mill, and the depth of water insufficient to navigate a boat. But the mill sluice is able to affect more than just depth. It can improve water quality as well.
There is absolutely nothing to beat the real pleasures of just pottering around on a river. But when you do, you can look around as you go. And here I'm so pleased with this river, because one of the real measures of reasonable water quality is whether you're seeing damselflies and dragonflies around. And all around me, as I'm coming up, I can see banded demoiselle. There's a couple of them there. The ones with the big blue blobs on, they're the males, and the green ones are the females, and they're going around on these both courtship dances and also declaring where they are to each other. But why it's a good measure of water quality is really that damselflies and dragonflies have a larval stage in the water, and they spend at least, well, in this particular species, 2 years underwater. In some species, it's 3 years. And if you're going to be that long underwater, it matters how good that water is. Otherwise, you're just not going to survive. But then when you get wonderful sunny days like this, well, then they're able to fly up and down. An overcast summer is extremely bad news for damselflies and dragonflies. But weather like this, can't beat it.
The mill is a European Commission directive sampling point, so it's one of the places in the river where water quality is monitored on a regular basis by Joe Goodson of the Environment Agency. Samples are taken, and Joe measures a number of the factors of the river's condition, including its temperature, its pH, or degree of acidity and alkalinity, its turbidity, and by placing in a probe, she can measure the life-giving oxygen dissolved in the water. Unfortunately, measuring the oxygen directly doesn't show whether that will be robbed by the rotting organic detritus in the water. So Joe takes a sample, and that will be left for 5 days and then remeasured. The Environment Agency have come to realise that measuring the chemical picture is only looking at what is in the river at that moment. So they're now putting more emphasis on sampling biological indications of what's going on, which gives a better long-term view of pollution incidents. By sorting out and identifying the various small animals found in her river sample, Joe can give a score for water quality that reflects past months of life in the river. The more types of species she finds, the better the long-term health of the river. In 2 years, some 50 species of invertebrates were found, including the underwater nymph stage of damselflies. Although the river does look good, in recent years it's not been achieving the desired oxygen requirements, so biological sampling has become important here. Some of the river's small animals have a high demand for oxygen and can be very susceptible to pollution. Their presence or absence in itself is a good indication of water quality. Lining up on the stones to stay in the current are mayfly nymphs. They cannot survive without reasonable oxygen levels, so they are a good sign. In contrast, this freshwater louse, whose antennae are seeking out decaying bits of plants and animals it's scavenging, is less demanding. A similar-looking crustacean bumbling about on its side is the freshwater shrimp, whose presence is a sign of reasonable oxygen levels. On the surface, pond skaters still prefer reasonable water. Leeches are common behind the mill, as they are in most rivers, for they're very undemanding of oxygen levels. They're a maligned group, for those that tap their victims at least leave them alive. By the mill are ones that feed from fish, water snails, and not for the squeamish, from the noses of moorhens. It looks a good range of water wildlife, but it should be more diverse. So what is the problem in the river? Farmers' fields are dressed with nitrate fertiliser, and much of that drains off into the watercourse. The Environment Agency recognises a virtual lack of control nationally over farmland fertiliser runoff. At the sewage works of the town upstream of the mill, as it works throughout most of Britain, the sewage is efficiently turned into relatively clean water. But it does not remove the high phosphate levels coming from detergents. Matters are made worse in this case because the river is small and only dilutes the treated sewage when it enters, 1:1, instead of the more usual 8:1. At a few sewage works in Britain, phosphate removal has worked well. And due to the particular problems here, the Water Authority planned to upgrade the sewage works to remove the phosphate. Until then, the phosphates and nitrates are acting as fertilisers, enriching the water.
When the nitrates run down from the fields into the river and the phosphates come out of the sewage works, they meet up in the water, and when you get the sun coming down on them, you have a recipe for algae. And unfortunately, that's what we're getting here. You're getting floating mats of algae. The algae, apart from just being an eyesore, is more of a problem to the invertebrates in the river, because as this stuff rots down, and you can see that it is, it's actually robbing the oxygen in the water, and that makes life harder for everything in there.
Algae develops both as floating mats and makes the water a turbid soup, both of which cut off the lower water weed from light. The effect has been to overall reduce oxygen and biological quality of the water. Fortunately, the mill can help. The mill's secret weapon in the war against pollution is its sluice gate. By raising the water, the river is not just deeper, but proportionally much wider, with a greater surface area in which oxygen dissolves. It also bubbles in oxygen as the water tumbles noisily over the sluice. Mill sluices have many assets for rivers, but sadly they have been disappearing.
The depth of this water is great. I can go up and down on my boat and I can enjoy myself. And that for me personally is wonderful. But there's more involved here. It's not just about one person enjoying his bit of water. What has happened nationally and internationally for most of this century is that the old historic ways of managing rivers have largely disappeared. People have thought in terms of, we're frightened of floods, let's get rid of the water. So it's all been moved away. Anything that could possibly obstruct water flow has been got rid of. So the old means of controlling things by having sluices have largely been pushed aside. And yet the magic of this sluice is tremendous. The flow of the river here seems enormous when you look down the sluice, but it's exactly the same as if the sluice wasn't here at all. What the sluice does is lift the amount of water. When it reaches the top height, again the flow continues. So the flow stays the same. What changes is the volume. And this volume of water makes all the difference in the world. Because by having the sluice here, it means upwater of me, not only is it deep enough to get my boat in, which otherwise I couldn't, but it's also deep enough to keep the edges along here quite marshy. And that's tremendous because the amount of wildlife that is in there can really benefit. There can just be more river wildlife. Overall, this sort of thing is a great benefit all round, but at the same time, you're able to stop having that terrible fear that's been haunting us over the last decade, and that's of rivers drying up. It's the worry that we've had with abstraction, people taking too much water out of it. And where do the rivers go? Well, if you've got sluice control, it means that you can actually increase the volume, even if you've got lower summer flows. Sluices have that magical ability to keep our rivers intact.
The tip-over channel on this sluice can still have its water raised further by a flashlock, dropped in just as in Saxon times. It's vital to raise the water for the watermill to be able to operate. And when watermills were more common than they are today, their sluices ensured our small lowland rivers held a much larger volume. The ancestors of these young moorhens over the last 1,000 years were ensured full rivers throughout Britain with good habitat by the sluices of working mills. This retained water was a national reservoir that we flushed away without realizing its loss. Everyone loves to play poo sticks. But it's not just the sticks that emerge from the sluice. Bubbles show up detergent and algae. In high summer and autumn, flows have been at their lowest, but the sluice has maintained river height. As autumn turns towards winter, the water meadows beside the mill become frosted. These low-lying fields flank the old river and are below the level of the mill head, and are a safety valve if the winter rains cause the river to rise. With the ground frozen hard on saturated soil, even if the mill head is dropped to the lowest level by leaving the gate fully open, the ground will quickly shed surface water when it rains, and the river will rise by 3 or 4 feet. When spring returns, the ground is still moist, so river levels can still be high. But the mill is safely set high above the natural river level, and the wide splash pool rapidly dissipates the force from the sluice. The ancient engineers, centuries ago, designed the waterways to avoid flooding the mill buildings and their products, and the system still works. Nonetheless, the ravages of time and force of water take their toll, so the river is down for vital maintenance work. Dave and Pete of the Environment Agency are repairing a leak through the sluice's wall. The structure of the sluice is late 18th century brick under protective mortar. The leak was found to be along previously unknown beams inside of an earlier wood sluice built probably in 1707. The brick one had just been built around it. The greater force of winter and spring flow bubbles in more oxygen and dilutes the proportion of the treated sewage effluent. But it also brings downstream an accumulation of rubbish. Non-biodegradable expanded polystyrene and plastic float down our rivers from the towns, and unless picked up, will find their way out to sea. The value of sluice's oxygenating role shows in the river's fish. Below the sluice, there are big shoals of sticklebacks and a range of coarse fish. But above the sluice, there are only small fry. The loss of river depth with the loss of a sluice can mean a reduction of a fish population by as much as 90%. The stone loach doesn't float. As it has no swim bladder, it stays feeding on the bottom of the splashpool. The old gate had become very leaky and was finding it difficult to keep a good head of water. Dave and Pete, after fixing the sluice's wall leak, made a new gate of oak which will last for many years. After checking the winding gear, the new gate is lowered into position. The Environment Agency, that took over from the National Rivers Authority, are keen that mill river structures should be maintained, so they can operate, particularly for flood control and water quality improvement. The new gates bring up the water level in half the time and hold a full head of water so it tips over the sluice at the proper height. The success of the Millhead Channel's water level can be measured by the abundance of the wild angelica that grows on its banks and in the mill's marsh beside it, for it's a true lover of marsh and wet woods. This was thought such a health-giving plant in the past that it must be of the angels, hence angelica. Water runs fast off a field like this, down to the river, making it rise quickly. While the sluice and the water meadows are part of the mill's defence system against flooding, the mill's marsh that we visited in the previous programme plays a significant role. When it rains, the water runs down the hill into the marsh, and the rising waters of the Millhead Channel and the Old River tip into it. The marsh absorbs the water like a sponge and slows down its rate of rise. The thrust through this century for more and more arable, for the great god corn, has produced landscapes very much like this. Huge acreages with drainage that takes water straight down to our rivers. You've got natural conditions, but you've also got a whole series of pipes across a field like this, always pushing the water out. Now contrast that, this sterile area, with the lushness of the marsh, and you can see why wildlife through fields like this over most of Britain have been lost, while these ancient landscapes, which can hang on to the moisture, have been a real haven and a survival oasis for pockets of wildlife. the concrete and tarmac from the new bypass, and new buildings of the town upstream of the mill, like the field drainage, are making rainfall reach the river faster than in the past. This is happening nationwide, but at least this mill is fortunate in still having its ancient marsh and sluice to protect it. The marsh straddles the old river, and where it emerges, it gets its own back on roads, as a ford. This is the original river, from which the mill's channel was cut, and it looks like it would have looked before the mill was built centuries ago.
Although it's hard to believe it, this very small stream here is the old original river, and it separates out one parish from another. And yet for me it has a much greater importance, because outside you've got the open marsh, but inside here, along either side of this small riverbank, you have a whole series of wild trees. This is nature in an untrammeled form, and in this cavernous, almost secret world, you have foxes and muntjac. It's a splendid inner world to the whole of the marsh.
To meet the foxes of the marsh, maintained by the mill's high waters, is to be aware of a living landscape. At night, my neighbour calls the foxes from the marsh, having put out food. The first animal to arrive is closer to home. But it's not long before a hedgehog is joined by one of the foxes. Join me in the next programme of the Mill's Life series when we go into the mill to discover its working life.